Creativity has been a fundamental cognitive process involved in problem solving and communication. But what is it that makes us pick up a tool like a pencil and mark a piece of paper with a drawing? Are we just marking our existence in a time and place? To explore creativity, I came up with 8 questions that I asked a wide range of people, from creativity researchers and psychologists to creatives from all walks of life: visual artists, musicians, cooks, comedians, and filmmakers. What is creativity?
Creativity, in my impression, is anything that is an idea that is sparked by the human mind. And creativity can be a number of different things. It can be like artistic creativity, it can be scientific creativity, it can be solving a math problem, it can be solving an architectural problem, or it can be like creating a beautiful painting. So there's many facets that creativity can take and that human beings have taken advantage of.
Excellent. Why do we create?
I think we create, it's part of the necessity of our surroundings. I think initially it was probably like an initial spark of creativity was the intent to react to our surroundings, to figure out how to eat and provide shelter and provide for our loved ones. And then as that started to be figured out, you get the agricultural lands that started to be figured out, the settlings of communities and civilizations, and then the burgeoning rise of cityscapes and how we create those. And what's been fascinating to witness is over the years, seeing the cave paintings in France, and seeing how these Cro-Magnons created these beautiful works of art 50,000 years ago, not aware that anyone was going to see them, but it was important to them. And then us being able to witness that is sort of an interesting aspect of the creative process, where we're able to see what their minds were thinking of, what was important to them when they were alive, and how that's affected, our culture and artistic, the burgeoning artistic, the way music and sculpture and film and paintings have all arisen, I think, from that.
Mm-hmm. That reminds me. Oh. Never mind. I'm sorry, I just forgot what I was going to say. It had to do with, I thought they proved some paintings recently were from Neanderthals or Denisovans.
Really? That's cool.
I thought so.
I'm sure you could carbon date the paint.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure that wouldn't be a problem. So, but if it
had to do with what they were painting, you just said what they were painting, what mattered to them, and what mattered to them were that's what it was. What mattered to them were game animals, right?
Yes, correct.
They're on the game trail. They needed here's what we're hunting.
Yeah.
That's what they would paint.
Yeah.
But I know you talked about mythology eventually in the previous interview.
Yeah.
But Joseph Campbell, I remember I don't remember what talk he was giving or what book it was from, but he was talking about the fact that probably
The Hero's Progress?
What?
The Hero's Progress?
No, it had to do with where does mythology come from?
Oh, I see.
And religions.
Uh-huh.
His idea was maybe, or probably, all religions and mythologies come from the fact that humans have to kill animals to survive, and that we feel guilty about that.
Oh, interesting.
So we built religions around, honoring the animals that we had to kill to eat and that kind of thing.
I think another important aspect of that is that, those cultures and societies would have seen their loved ones die. And you're only born knowing life. You don't know what is beyond. So in the same way the animals died, if these these tribes people died as well, and where do they go from there? So is it I think mythology and creativity stems from the human being's opportunity and almost neediness to imagine something beyond what this world is, and most of the time it takes the shape of this world but slightly different. It's not completely weird and different from what we already know. It's just another level of life which we already know. We can't know what is beyond what we already have. So I think a lot of the rise of mythology, the rise of creativity, arises from those ideas like the Greek concepts of like Zeus and Apollo and everything, and they're a family, and they're a dysfunctional family, and they arose from the Titans, they were dysfunctional from the Titans, and then so it's interesting that even woven within like Greek mythology, you have family disputes amongst the family members, which I find an interesting aspect of like what they could be anything, they're these all powerful beings, and yet they have very human problems. So I think we tend to like, as being creative, tend to impart those concepts onto like beings of mythology as well.
Totally. That kind of answers where does creativity come from, what we're already talking about. Is there any more to add to that, do you think?
One aspect, I think, when you think of creativity, I think you tend to think, I initially tend to think of the arts. I tend to think of, like painting and film and music. But there's also the creativity of the human mind that leads to like science discoveries. And I think one of the most interesting of those is like Albert Einstein, who would like create thought experiments for himself. He wasn't creating experiments that other people had given him. He was creating them to like sort of help solve problems in his own mind, which I find fascinating. So in that respect, he's, from a creative point of view, he's trying to figure out the math problem by creating various scenarios in this world to help solve what would ultimately be like a math like problem that was ultimately resolved, and he was proven right when he finally did win the Nobel Prize for relativity. So I think that's interesting that he, from a creative point of view, he was creating thought experiments for himself in order to be as creative as possible.
Yeah. How can we foster creativity? What can we do?
I think like creativity is fostered through mentorships, support from like teachers and parents. I know that my parents weren't artists themselves, but they were very supportive of my interest in like art and film and animation. And I think that the teachers that I had helped, support that as well. But ultimately, it's something that it was innately within me that I could make myself better by looking what other people had done. But it was really it was a vocation that I noticed that like I was only getting better because I loved it so much that I was doing it over and over again. Like the concept of, you're being a professional at something by doing it for 10,000 hours or something like that. So I know I did like that much time drawing easily in my youth. And for me, I had a love of film and I had a love of drawing. So animation was sort of the combination of those two loves. So I was able to sort of like initially start in like traditional drawn animation and then transition into CG animation and sort of apply the same rules that creatively you kind of like learn from the Nine Old Men and the Illusion of Life book.
Squash and stretch.
Yeah, exactly. And like I went to the Sheridan College School of like Fine Arts and classical character animation, and that was a huge help because you're working with other artists that you're put in this, same room, and you're all feeding off of the same creative interests. And I remember like I wasn't sure if I was going to go to film school or animation school, and then the animation school, when I heard the various categories and classes that I'd be taking, like every class was like fascinating and interesting to me, whether it was like film history or storyboarding or layout or all the aspects of it that went into animation. Like I found every one of them interesting, whereas film, it was, you could break it down into like sort of the editing process, which we had to learn at Sheridan as well, but I didn't find that as interesting as the creative aspect and the drawing. But what was great was that it gave you a well-rounded experience, but it was always in service of the creative drive that you had within you to try and, it was always up to you. Like if you wanted to work in the studio later, you could, and just, create very cool stuff. And what was fun was that you had a Bolex camera and plain paper, and whatever you imagined you could create. You just needed time. So that was an interesting aspect of like going to that school, and what I learned when I went and got into like professional atmosphere at Blue Studios in Dublin, Ireland, and just working every night after hours and just working on my own stuff to eventually show it to Don Bluth and then make my way to character animator. So that was just coming up with ideas that I thought would be interesting and would sort of get them as interested in me as an animator as I was in animation.
Awesome. I didn't know you worked with Don Bluth.
Yeah, yeah.
Oh.
He was great.
Is there a connection between creativity and sleep or dreams? Because where this question comes from, mostly, is there was a book in the 80s, maybe, a guy named Paul Zolo, I think, who was a musician, and he wrote a book, Songwriters on Songwriting. And it's a whole book of just interviews, like I'm doing. And, he interviewed Dylan and the Beatles and all stuff. But the first interview is Pete Seeger. And Pete Seeger said, there's some quote in there about, most of the songs that I write, I wrote in a dream. And I just wake up with the song.
Wow.
And like Salvador Dali would try to get himself into like micro dream states to then paint surrealist paintings.
Interesting.
So does creativity have anything to do with sleep or dreams, do you think?
I think it does, because I think we're problem solving. Our minds are problem solving when we're dreaming. It's our way, it's the human mind's way of like resolving the problems that we have to deal with on a daily basis, whether they're like short-term struggles and apprehensions or long-term goals. Dreams, I think, have a way of like sneaking in there, and I know that you're kind of awake and you're able to absorb those types of those concepts and ideas, because I've fallen asleep in front of the TV when like The Shining was playing, and all of a sudden my dream was a horror dream, even though I was fast asleep. So it's like, how is that? Is it like, I was obviously auditory? You're getting some sorts of input, you're in many ways. I've had dreams like that where I've had the TV on, and then all of a sudden my dreams have been influenced by what's been playing on the TV, even though I was asleep. So I found that fascinating, that your body is still, even though it's asleep, it's still willing to accept stimulus. In that respect, I think that like dreams are extremely important to not only help define the creative process, but like, where we're going. I think a lot of dreams evolved. I think like mythology evolved out of people having ideas and dreams, and how important they are, though, I think is measured by what you do with them when you're awake. Like what you, like to your point, the musician who had a dream and he woke up and immediately wrote it down. He needed to immediately write it down to make sure that he memorized it. So I've heard of many professional musicians that the riff or the melody like comes to them very quick, and they'll like James Cameron, who worked with James Horner. And James Horner, the melody would come to him very quickly. What took him time was to actually write out the music for the entire orchestra. And so like they composed it's like a very famous story about like the score for Aliens. Like he was on set at Pinewood Studios in London, England, and they were focusing so much on the sound effects of the machine guns that they were taking time away from the music. And I got down to like 2.5-3 weeks where James Horner had to write the score for the entire movie, and then of course they're making editing changes at the same time, so which affects the cut. So and then what do you get? You get one of the most iconic soundtracks in film history. So I think sometimes there can be an urgency to the creative process where you're driven to, like, and you're forced because of circumstance to be as creative as possible in that time allowed under pressure. And a lot of artists can handle that, and a lot of artists can't. They tend to work at their own schedule and their own pace and time. But I know that with filmmaking, it's very much about being creative on a time schedule and within a budget. And some budgets are enormous, or hundreds of millions of dollars, and some budgets are very small. But either way, that can force you to be more creative because you have less time and less money.
That's very true. Are creative people mad?
I guess it depends on how you define mad. I think that creative people tend to be different. They tend to look at the world a different way. Whether that equates to mad or insane, I don't know. But I know that a lot of the creative people that I've looked at and studied, there's varying layers and subtleties to how you would perceive a definition like mad. Like Jack Nicholson, for example, when he's doing a performance, it's an extension of how he is as already. So when you see him interviewed, he has that Joker-like smile and sort of that devilish quality to his eyebrows and eyes, which he imbues into the characters. But he's already a character as well when he plays those characters. So in that respect, I think he's bringing some aspect of his madness or his character qualities to the roles. Other character actors like Robert De Niro, when they're interviewed, they're very sedate and calm, and they're able to go crazy with their performances, like the work that he's done in like Raging Bull and The Deer Hunter. You wouldn't expect a person who's that calm on the outside to have that within them, and yet he's able to like bring it out as well. And so you see that with actors, they have both that quality. As well in music, you could have a musician like, I'm a huge fan of Neil Peart, who's the drummer from Rush, who passed away a couple of years ago, but I was always amazed and impressed by his continuous drive to be better. He was asked to perform at a Buddy Rich concert where he had to perform a famous Buddy Rich suite known as Cottontail. And he was doing crossovers and triplets, and everyone in the background band was just astounded by what he was doing. And then when he finished it, he was like about 40, I believe. And he thought to himself, is this as good as I get? Do I not get any better? And he went out of his way to consult a music professor and just said, I want to break down my structure and how I hold the sticks and everything, and just reinvent how I play drums. So here's a guy who is arguably one of the greatest drummers in the world, who wants to reinvent how he's drumming because he thinks he can be better. That's not madness. That to me is like, a very focused vocation of like, how can I be better at what I'm a professional at? And what's amazing is that he became better. He became a better drummer because he unlearned everything that he had learned and learned it better. So he's always been for me an inspiration of, regardless of what art or creativity or what thing you do, whether you're like a scientist or an artist, you're always striving to be the better version of what you already are. And I think he's a great example of that. And I wouldn't call him mad. I would call him, extremely focused in all of, because he's so, the word that I always hear when I hear about his drumming is precision. Like he's precisely hitting, even though it's crazy fast, the precision with which he's hitting every drum and tom and cymbal is incredible. So and that comes from, not madness, that comes from like an extremely focused vocation of like wanting to better yourself as an artist. And I think that's certainly part of the creative spirit, but I wouldn't necessarily call it madness. But in some respects, as with Nicholson, it doesn't hurt.
How do you see creativity helping us in the future?
I think it's helpful in so many ways in how it influences science and how we position ourselves as these beings on Earth and how long we're going to ultimately be here. What's endlessly fascinating is that if you chart, the amount of time that human beings have been around on planet Earth, it's like roughly 200,000 years. But if you imagine that as like a novel of like 200 pages, you're really only the last page. You're getting, you're getting the advent of like guns and like not only air travel but space travel, going to the moon, nuclear capabilities, and then all of the way the world has completely changed with computers and personal computers, personal phones. And that's just in the last like 40 years that's really become so important. So I think it's becoming exponential in what we're learning and how that is going to ultimately be important in the future to help us relate to our environment and not overwhelm it or take over it. The Earth will get along just fine without us. Hundreds of millions of years from now, the Earth will still be here in whatever form. So how we relate to it and use our creativity to be part of that world, I think is going to help define like the role of human beings in the world, and our role in preserving the other species of the earth, and how important that is for us, and because we're all part of the same ecosystem. And we'll see where it goes, but what's interesting is that every aspect of creativity helps to inform. It's not just science that helps to create the computer, it's art. It's the study of like how to make something visually interesting, how to make something stimulating to the human is not just science. And even though science itself can be stimulating, but the concept that you're constantly combining these things as part of the creative process to like make ourselves better and make ourselves like have meaning, I think is ultimately what's the most important.
Absolutely. All right, that is my last question.
Great.
Anything you'd like to add before I turn everything off?
Well, I think like you can probably tell by my home that I like to surround myself with other works of art, or surround myself with paintings and sculpture, and music, and the things that interest me, and the wildlife, and the animal form, the human form. All of those I find fascinating, and I think all of those help inform my creative input. And I ultimately come back to Neil Peart's concept of always bettering yourself as an artist, and always realizing that you can be a better version of yourself, which I think is all part of the creative process. So I think even though I'm not a musician, there's an awful lot that I can learn from that approach to creativity, and ultimately what everyone can learn from that approach to creativity, whether they're scientists or artists or whatever, architects, and how they help define creativity as we move forward into the future.
Awesome. All right. Thank you so much.
Sure.
Telepathy is real, and I can feel you in my bones. Your thoughts are in the air, and they're landing in my mouth, converging from all directions. The energy is at home. Words from a long lost conversation, a fleeting and reborn. Telepathy is real, and electric lines of light are traversing vast dimensions and appearing in my sight. In books, TV, and movies, the messages come through. Strange, vast potentials are planted in your room. From the air or from under the stairs, it's all coming to you. Staring into space or a stranger's face, you can read the proof. Telepathy is real, and I'm hearing you from the vast belly